She elevated her stove on stone pillars. Ephraim Cutter, who had survived 12 spring floods running the Yellowstone Ferry, told her, "That river will kill your fire and drown you and that girl where you sleep." She had $31, a 10-year-old niece, and no way to move above the flood line. On April 23, 1883, the river rose 3 feet in 6 hours and drowned every stove in the settlement. But 5 months earlier, Mara Elling Voss had never laid a course of stone in her life. She had arrived in the lower Yellowstone drainage in November of 1882 with a dead husband's debts, a cracked cast-iron cook stove strapped to a borrowed freight wagon, and $31 folded inside her boot. The cabin Jonas had started sat unfinished on a river lot he had claimed the spring before he died. Half a log frame, no proper chinking on the north wall, a puncheon floor laid rough over packed dirt. The land was good, flat, dark soil near the ferry road, cottonwoods for shade and fuel, water close enough to carry without breaking your back. That was why Jonas had filed on it. That was also why it sat where the river could reach it. Mara Elling Voss did not know that yet, not the way she would come to know it. What she knew in November was this: her husband had died on a freight road in January when a sleigh tongue snapped and the load crushed his chest against a stump. He left her $11 in coin, a stove with a cracked warming shelf, a half-built cabin on a quarter section she could not afford to abandon, and $20 owed to a hardware dealer in Miles City for nails and hinges he had not lived to use. Her sister, Karen, had taken in Mara's niece, Anna, 10 years old, small for her age, quiet, after the funeral. Then Karen died of fever in September, and Anna arrived on a mail stage with a cloth bundle and no expression on her face at all. Mara owed money she did not have. She owned land she could not leave. She had a child who was not legally hers, but who had no one else. And she had roughly 5 months before the valley woke up and showed her what kind of ground Jonas had chosen. The first weeks were work without rest. She hired a neighbor's son for 2 days at $1 a day to help raise the remaining wall logs. She chinked gaps with river clay mixed with dry grass, pressing it into seams with her bare hands until her fingers cracked and bled. She hung a canvas flap where the door would be and told Anna they would have boards before Christmas. She lied. She could not afford boards. The canvas stayed until February, when she traded 3 days of laundry work to a freighter's wife for a plank door with a broken hinge she hammered straight. The stove was her single valuable possession. A number 7 Acme cast iron box stove, second-hand, firebox intact, warming shelf cracked along the back seam but still holding. She had it set on flat stones in the center of the cabin because that was how Jonas had planned it: center placement for heat distribution, pipe running straight up through a tin collar in the roof. The stones were uneven. The stove rocked when she fed it. She shimmed it with a cedar wedge and called it done. By December, the cabin was closed enough to hold heat if she kept the stove fed. The puncheon floor was rough but solid underfoot. Anna slept on a straw tick along the warm wall. Mara slept on a blanket roll near the door because she woke 3 times a night to feed the fire, and it was easier not to climb over the child. They ate salt pork, beans, cornmeal, and whatever Mara could barter for at the ferry landing. She had $19 left after paying the neighbor's boy and buying lamp oil. $19. A sick cow would cost her everything. A broken axle on the stovepipe would cost her everything. A child's fever that needed a doctor 40 miles away would cost her everything. She counted money the way a soldier counts ammunition, not by what she had, but by how many emergencies stood between her and zero. Winter passed. It was not the worst winter the valley had seen. That was the problem. It was ordinary enough to make her believe she understood the place. In March, the man who would tell her she was going to die came to assess her lot. Ephraim Cutter was 58 years old and looked older. He had operated the ferry crossing 4 miles downstream for 11 years, and had served as a U.S. Army wagon master for 6 years before that. He knew the Yellowstone's moods the way a stockman knows a bad bull, not with affection, not with fear exactly, but with the kind of deep attention that comes from having been hurt. He had survived 12 spring breakups on that stretch of river. He had pulled 2 drowned men from ice jams. He had watched the 1878 flood take a store, a stable, and a family's entire seed stock in a single night. He arrived at Mara's cabin on a cold Tuesday in early March, leading a mule loaded with salt and tobacco he was hauling to the upper camps before the road softened. He had known Jonas. He had told Jonas the lot was too low. Jonas had not listened. Cutter did not knock. He stood outside the canvas-patched window and looked at the ground. Then he walked the perimeter of the cabin, studying the distance between the floor sill and the dirt. He crouched by the nearest cottonwood and pressed his thumb against the bark, where a dark stain changed color about 3 feet above the roots. He checked 2 more trees. Then he came to the door. Mara opened it with flour on her hands. Anna stood behind her, holding a bowl. "Your husband set this cabin inside an old side channel," Cutter said. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask how she was managing. "You can see where the water sat if you know what the bark is telling you." Mara looked past him at the cottonwood. She saw the stain. She had seen it before and thought it was just where the snow crust had pressed during melt. "That is not snow melt staining," Cutter said, following her eyes. "That is flood line, water heavy enough to strip the outer bark clean. It sat there long enough to kill everything below it." He pointed at the base of the tree, where the roots were smooth and polished, free of moss. "Look at those roots. Nothing grows below the line. The river scoured it." "How high?" Mara asked. "On that tree? 32 inches, maybe 34. He turned and looked at the cabin. "Your floor sits about 8 inches above the grade, which means in a bad spring, you're looking at 2 feet of water inside your house, maybe more." Mara said nothing. She was calculating. 2 feet of water meant the stove would be underwater. The firebox door sat 14 inches off the floor. The kindling box sat on the floor. The straw ticks sat on the floor. Everything that kept them warm and alive sat on the floor. "Your stove goes cold the minute that water reaches the ash pan," Cutter said. "Once the fire is out, you have got wet bedding, contaminated water, no way to boil, and a child." He looked at Anna, then back at Mara. "When that river comes through your floor, widow or not, it will put your fire out and drown you where you sleep." "Does it flood every spring?" Mara asked. "Not every spring. Some years it barely rises past the bank. Some years it takes everything below the bench. You cannot predict it. That is the point." He paused. "The smart thing is to move. Get up on higher ground. The bench north of the ferry road sits 12 feet above this flat." "That ground is not mine." "File on it." "I cannot afford to file again. I cannot afford to move the stove. I do not have a wagon team, and I still owe $12 on the stove and pipe." She said it without self-pity, the way a person reads a receipt. Cutter looked at the cabin, then at the sky, then at Mara. "Then I hope you get a dry spring," he said, "because if you do not, this cabin becomes a cold bath by April, and you and that girl will be sitting in it." He gathered his mule's lead rope and left without looking back. Mara stood in the doorway with flour drying on her fingers. Anna had not moved from the table. She had heard everything. "Are we going to drown?" Anna asked. "No," Mara said. She closed the door. She did not yet know how to keep that promise. For 2 weeks after Cutter's visit, Mara did nothing about the flood risk. She could not afford to think about it. She had corn to grind, seams to re-chink before the thaw loosened her clay, fence posts to set for the cow, and a child who needed watching. She worked from first light until the fire burned low and fell asleep with her boots on, more nights than not. But the stain on the cottonwood bark would not leave her mind. She had grown up in Minnesota, daughter of a Norwegian immigrant father, who had worked as a river freighter and part-time sawyer before his back gave out. Halvor Elling had spent 20 years reading water, not from books, from bark, from root lines, from the polished shoulders of river stones, from the dark tide mark that floodwater left on bridge pilings and fence posts after it receded. He had taught his daughters to see what the river remembered even when people forgot. One afternoon in late March, Mara went out to strip cottonwood bark for kindling. She carried a hand axe and a canvas sack. The day was cold but soft, the kind of fall spring day that melts the top crust and refreezes it by dark. She worked her way along the tree line at the edge of her lot, peeling loose bark and dropping it in the sack. At the third tree, she stopped. The flood stain was there. Dark, smooth, the bark stripped of its rough outer layer in a band that ran around the trunk at roughly knee height. But above it, caught in a fork where two branches split, she saw something else. A tangle of dried reed fibers, gray and brittle, pressed into the crevice like packing material. She reached up and pulled a piece free. It crumbled between her fingers. Old, years old, and it was higher than the stain cutter had shown her. The reeds sat at nearly 3 feet. She checked the next tree. Same pattern, stain at one height, trapped debris at another, higher. The reeds and drift marked a different flood, a worse one. She cut a stick to the height of the debris line, 37 inches from the ground. She carried the stick back to the cabin and held it against the interior wall. The mark sat above the seat of her only chair. It sat above the top of the kindling box. It sat 3 inches above the warming shelf of the stove. Everything she owned that mattered, fire, fuel, water, bedding, lived below that line. She stood in the center of the cabin holding the stick and heard her father's voice, not as memory, but as instruction. Water lies when it is moving. Trees tell the truth after. That night, after Anna was asleep, Mara sat at the table with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown paper torn from a flour sack. She did not draw well, but she could think in shapes. She sketched the cabin floor. She marked the stove position. She drew a line across the wall at 37 inches and stared at it. If the water came in and she could not stop it, and Cutter was right, she could not stop it, then the question was not how to keep the water out. The question was how to keep the things that mattered above the water. The stove. If the stove went under, they lost heat and the ability to boil water. In a flood with mud and debris, the only safe drinking water was boiled water. A cold, wet cabin with no boiling capacity was not shelter. It was a coffin that took longer, dry fuel. If the kindling got soaked, even a working stove was useless. She needed fuel stored above the line, bedding, wet blankets, and cold air wick heat from a body faster than bare skin. Anna weighed barely 60 pounds. Hypothermia would take her faster than an adult. Water storage. If the flood fouled the ground well, they needed sealed water already stored clean. 4 things: stove, fuel, bedding, water. Everything else, the table, the chairs, the trunk of clothes, the washboard, could survive wet or be replaced. Those 4 things could not, so raise them. Not the whole cabin. She could not jack the entire structure above floodline. She did not have the tools, the labor, or the time. But she could raise a section of the floor, a platform, a broad mass of stone, high enough to keep those 4 essentials above where the river had reached before. A stone island, inside her own house. She sketched it, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, taking up nearly half the main room. Fieldstone and granite block laid in courses, bedded on clay and sand mortar, rising to 34 or 36 inches. The stove on top, kindling box on top, bed on top, sealed water crocks on top. The rest of the room could flood and it would not matter, because the things that kept them alive would sit above it. The idea was simple. The execution was not. She would need stone, hundreds of pounds of it, hauled from the river bar and the bluff face, sorted by shape and weight, carried or dragged to the cabin. She would need clay for mortar, dug, mixed, applied in courses that would hold under their own weight. She would need to cut through the puncheon floor in the platform area and dig down to firm earth because that much stone on weak planking would buckle and collapse. She would need to reset the stove and pipe without cracking the firebox or losing draft. And she would need to do all of it before the thaw brought the river up. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the spring stayed cold. With a bad wrist, a 10-year-old helper, and no one who thought it was a good idea. She folded the paper and put it inside her boot with the remaining money. $19 and a drawing. That was her entire defense against a river that had already marked her house for drowning. The first person to tell her it was foolish was the person she most needed on her side. Lena Burdick lived a quarter-mile east on a lot that sat 6 inches higher than Mara's, enough to matter. She had 4 children under 12, a husband who freighted between Miles City and the upper camps for weeks at a stretch, and the kind of practical intelligence that kept families alive on credit and root vegetables. She was not cruel. She was tired, and she did not have patience for ideas that sounded like grief talking. Mara found her at the well they shared, filling buckets in the thin morning light. She explained the platform. She described the height, the stone, the mortar, the stove placement. She showed the measurement stick. Lena listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Mara finished, Lena set her bucket down and looked at her. "Even if the water comes," Lena said, "how do you live on a shelf all spring? You're talking about putting your bed and your stove 3 feet in the air in a room that is already too small. Where does the child play? Where do you set a table? Where do you walk?" She picked up the bucket. "And if it never comes, if this is a dry year, which it might be, you have crippled your own house for nothing. You will have built a stone altar in your kitchen and called it sense." "The trees say it comes," Mara said. "Trees," Lena said. She did not laugh. She looked at Mara the way a woman looks at another woman she respects but cannot follow. "Mara, I am sorry about Jonas. I'm sorry about Karin, but you have $19 and a child who needs a normal house, not a fortress against a river that may not rise. Build a root cellar, fix your door, buy flour. Do not tear up your own floor. If the river comes and my stove goes under, Anna and I have no heat and no clean water. That is not grief talking. That is arithmetic." Lena picked up both buckets, then moved to higher ground. "With what?" Lena had no answer for that. She carried her water home. Mara stood at the well alone. The morning was quiet. A magpie called from the cottonwoods. She could hear the river low and slow under its remaining ice, making the soft grinding sound it made when the current worked against the frozen surface. Lena was not wrong about the cost. Half her living space, gone. Weeks of labor that could go toward planting or fence repair. Stone hauling that would wreck her already damaged wrist. And if the river stayed low, she would have built a monument to fear in the middle of her home. But Lena had not stood inside the cabin holding a stick at 37 inches and counted what lived below the mark. Mara walked home and began pulling up puncheon boards. The news traveled the way all news traveled in a valley settlement of 30-odd souls, through the ferry landing, the store, and the well. Silas Pruitt heard about it first, because Silas heard about everything first. He kept the only store between the ferry and the upper road, and he used it the way a spider uses a web, not just to catch trade, but to feel every vibration in the settlement. He knew who owed what, who had sold which claim, who was buying seed and who was buying whiskey. He had been asking about Mara's river lot since Jonas died. River lots near ferry roads had value. Distressed widows sold cheap. He had extended Mara $12 of credit for the stove debt Jonas left behind, and he held that note the way a man holds a leash. As long as she owed him, he had leverage. If she failed, if she abandoned the claim or could not prove up, he would be first in line to acquire it. When he heard she was tearing up her own floor to build a stone platform for a cook stove, he smiled. Not because he was evil, because it confirmed what he already believed. Grief and isolation had made her unsteady, and unsteady women abandoned claims. The confrontation came 3 days after Mara started digging. She walked to the store for coarse nails and extra pipe screws. She would need to refit the stovepipe after raising the stove, and she could not afford mistakes with the draft. The store was half full. 2 freighters waiting on tobacco, Lena's eldest boy buying salt, and an older man named Harlan Pike who lived alone and mostly kept quiet. Silas stood behind his counter with his sleeves rolled, sorting hardware into bins. Mara set her items on the counter. 4 pipe screws, a handful of 6-penny nails, and I will need the price on the coarse nails per pound. Silas looked at the items. He looked at Mara. Then he spoke loudly enough for the room. She is raising a stove to the rafters so the river can bow to it. The room shifted. Harlan Pike looked up. The freighters paused. Mara did not flinch. I am raising what cannot be replaced. You are raising a child on a stone shelf in a house you cannot afford to finish, Silas said. He leaned forward. How high are you building this thing? 3 feet? You understand that is higher than a proper table? You are going to climb up to your own bed like a child climbing into a hayloft. I will build steps. Steps. Silas shook his head. Mara, your husband, God rest him, picked that lot because the soil was good and the road was close. He did not pick it to drown in. If you are afraid of water, sell the lot and move. I will give you a fair price. There it was, the offer underneath the mockery. I'm not selling, Mara said. Then you're building an altar for a cook stove while your girl goes without shoes. He wrapped the screws in paper and pushed them across the counter. 4 cents for the screws. Nails are 7 cents a pound. I'll put it on your account. Mara picked up the screws. She could feel the room watching. The freighters had stopped pretending not to listen. Harlan Pike was staring at his boots. How much do I owe now? She asked. $12.43, Silas said. Counting today. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Silas say to no one in particular, Grief builds strange houses. Anna was waiting by the wagon trace when Mara got back. What did he say? She asked. She always asked. She had learned that the store was where threats came from. He said I was building an altar, Mara said. Are you? I am building a place the river cannot reach. Help me carry the small stones from the east pile. We need 20 more before dark. They worked until the light failed. Mara's left wrist throbbed with each stone she lifted. She wrapped it in a strip of wool and kept going. Anna carried stones the size of bread loaves in both arms, walking carefully across the yard, setting each one at the cabin door where Mara could reach it from inside. Neither of them spoke much. The magpie had gone quiet. The river made its grinding sound in the distance. Inside the cabin, the platform footprint was marked by bare earth where the puncheons had been pulled. The first base stones sat in a shallow trench Mara had dug to firm ground. They looked like nothing, a jumble of rock and a torn-up floor. The stove sat off to the side, cold, because she had to move it before she could dig. She cooked on a small fire outside and carried hot food in. The cabin smelled like dirt and clay. The bed was pushed against the far wall in a space that would get smaller every day. Anna's straw tick barely fit. 20 more stones before dark, then 30 tomorrow. Then mix the clay. Then lay the first real course. The river made its sound. The snow on the shaded bank had gone gray and crystalline, the rotten texture that meant it was dying from below. Thaw was not coming. Thaw was already here, working in silence, loosening the grip of ice on water, and Mara had a trench in her floor and a pile of stones that did not yet reach her ankle. She had 2 weeks, maybe less, and every person in the valley except a 10-year-old girl thought she had lost her mind. If someone has ever dismissed what you were building before they understood why, tell us about it in the comments. Because what happens next in this valley changes everything about who was right. The man who changed everything arrived on foot, carrying a stone hammer and a leather roll of chisels on the 9th day of April. Mara was at the river bar, sorting stone. She had developed a system over the previous week. Drag the flat-bedded ones to one pile, the round ones to another, reject anything that crumbled when struck. She worked on her knees in cold mud, testing faces with her knuckle, rolling stones onto their broadest side to check if they sat stable. Her wrist was wrapped in doubled wool, and it still ached. Her knees were bruised black. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and the platform inside the cabin stood at only 11 inches, less than a third of the height she needed. She did not hear him approach. She was striking a slab of gray granite with a hand axe, trying to break it along a seam, when a voice behind her said, "You are hitting the grain wrong. Turn it a quarter and try again." She turned. The man was old, 60 or more, with dark, weathered skin, a short gray beard, and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone she was sorting. He wore a wool capote, canvas trousers patched at both knees, and moccasins that were nearly worn through. The leather roll of tools hung from his belt like a surgeon's kit. "I am Etienne Larocque," he said. He did not offer his hand. He crouched beside the granite slab, turned it 90 degrees, and tapped it once with the heel of his own hammer. The stone split clean along the seam, 2 flat pieces falling apart like pages of a book. Mara stared at the break. She had been hammering that stone for 10 minutes. "You sort by face and weight," Etienne said, looking at her piles. "That's correct. Most people haul at random and wonder why their walls lean." He picked up one of her flat stones and turned it in his hands. "Where are you building?" "Inside my cabin, a platform for the stove." He set the stone down. "How high?" 34 inches, maybe 36. "Mortar?" "Clay and sand." "Base preparation?" "I dug through the floor to firm earth, packed gravel underneath." Etienne looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recognition, not of need, but of method. She had not said, "I am building a wall and I need help." She had said clay and sand mortar and packed gravel underneath. She had described process, not desperation. "Who taught you to dig to firm earth?" he asked. "No one," Mara said. "The floor planks bounced when I stacked test weight on them. I figured the stone needed ground, not wood." Etienne Larocque was Métis, mixed French-Canadian and indigenous, and had spent 30 years working stone along northern rivers. He had built hearths, chimneys, ferry abutments, and foundation pads from the Red River to the Missouri. He had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company as a transport mason, setting stone wherever freight needed solid footing. He was wintering upriver with his grown sons and had come down to the ferry crossing on a supply errand when he saw a woman on her knees at the river bar, sorting stone by face instead of size. That was what stopped him. Not her need, her method. "Show me the cabin," he said. She showed him. He stood inside the torn-up room and looked at the trench, the base stones, the shallow courses she had begun to lay. He said nothing for a long time. Then he crouched and pressed his palm flat against the base course, the way a doctor presses a chest. "This stone rocks," he said, pointing to one in the second row. "Feel it." Mara pressed it. It shifted a quarter inch under her hand. A rocking stone in a base course will crack everything above it, pull it out, replace it with one that sits dead. Dead means it does not move when you press the center, the corner, or the edge. He showed her, pressing each point, feeling for wobble. "A platform this high must sit like it grew from the ground. Otherwise the stove will tilt the first time weight shifts." He pulled 3 more stones from her first courses. Each one rocked. She had not felt the movement because she had been pressing from the top, not testing the edges. "The stone tells you where it wants to sit," Etienne said. "Broad beds down, always, never on edge. A stone on edge is a stone waiting to fall." He laid a replacement piece, pressing it into the packed gravel, adjusting it with small taps of his hammer until it sat without any movement at all. "Now put your hand on it." She did. The stone was motionless, solid. It felt different from anything she had laid so far, not just placed, but set. "That is the difference between a pile and a platform," Etienne said. He stood and looked at the stove sitting cold against the far wall. "When does the river come?" "Cutter says any time after mid-April. Could be a week, could be 3. "Then we have a week," Etienne said. "Show me where you store your clay." He did not say, "I will help you." He did not discuss payment or barter. He simply began working, as though the project had always included him and he was merely arriving late. Mara understood. This was not charity. This was a craftsman who had found someone doing his kind of work badly and could not walk away from it any more than she could walk away from the flood marks on the trees. They worked until dark. Etienne pulled apart and relayed her entire base course in 4 hours. He showed her how to mix clay mortar to the right consistency, wet enough to grip, dry enough not to slump. He showed her how to tap stones into their beds with the handle of the hammer, not the head, because the handle transmitted vibration without fracture. He showed her how to check level by pouring a thin stream of water across the top course and watching where it pooled. By the time the light failed, the base course was relayed and the second course was begun. Properly this time. Mara's hands were raw. Her back ached from crouching, but when she pressed the stones, nothing moved. Anna brought them cold cornbread and water. Etienne ate without pausing in his assessment of the remaining stone pile. "You need heavier stock for the 3rd and 4th courses," he said. "The ones you have will do for fill, but the face stones that bear the stove weight must be at least twice this thickness. Tomorrow I will show you where to find them." "I cannot pay you," Mara said. "I did not ask for payment," Etienne said. "I asked where you store your clay." That night, after Etienne had gone to sleep under his own canvas by the ferry trace, Mara sat in the cabin with the lamp turned low. The base course glowed in the firelight, pale granite and dark riverstone set in clay the color of rust. It was beautiful in the way that solid things are beautiful. It did not move. It did not lean. It sat on the earth like it had always been there. She looked at the mark on the wall. 37 inches. The platform was at 12 inches now. 25 more to go. Outside, the river's grinding sound had changed. Softer. The ice was thinning. She could hear water moving underneath it, finding channels, testing edges, remembering its old paths. The snow on the shaded bank had collapsed into gray slush that would be gone by morning. The thaw was not coming. The thaw was here. And Mara Elling Voss had 12 inches of stone between her family and a river that had already written its intentions on every tree in the valley. Etienne Larocque did not teach the way Mara expected. He did not explain and then watch. He worked beside her, hands on the same stone, and corrected through touch. When she set a face stone crooked, he did not say, "That is wrong." He put his palm on the stone and pushed gently until she felt the wobble herself. When she mixed mortar too wet, he picked up a handful and squeezed it until water ran between his fingers and held the dripping clay in front of her without speaking. She mixed the next batch drier. He nodded once. They moved on. On the second morning, he brought her to a bluff face a quarter-mile upriver where winter frost had sheared granite slabs from the exposed ledge. The slabs lay in a scatter at the base, some as large as tabletops, most the size of a man's chest. He showed her how to read the fracture lines where the stone had split clean and where it had crumbled. Clean break means the grain is tight, he said. Crumble means the frost went deep and the stone is rotten inside. Rotten stone holds mortar for a season and then spits it out. He kicked a crumbled slab and it fell apart under his boot. Feel the face. Tight grain feels slick. Rotten grain feels rough like sugar. Mara ran her hand across a clean slab. Slick. She ran it across a crumbled one. Gritty. The difference was obvious once she knew to look for it. They spent the morning hauling. Etienne had borrowed a mule and a stone boat, a flat wooden drag, from the ferry stock. They loaded slabs onto the drag, 4 or 5 at a time, and the mule pulled them down the trace to the cabin while Mara and Etienne walked alongside, keeping the load balanced with their hands. Anna met them at the door and helped roll the smaller pieces inside. The work was brutal. Each slab weighed between 40 and 80 pounds. Mara's bad wrist screamed every time she gripped an edge. She wrapped it tighter, shifted more weight to her right hand, and kept going. By noon, the skin on her palms had torn open in 2 places. She packed the tears with clay and did not mention them. Etienne noticed. He said nothing about it directly. Instead, he showed her how to use the pry bar and a fulcrum stone to lever heavy pieces into position without gripping. Your hands are tools, he said. If you break them, the project stops. Lift with the bar. Save the hands for setting. That afternoon, they laid the 3rd course. Etienne taught her the principle of breaking joints, never aligning the vertical seams between courses, because aligned seams create a fault line that splits under load. Think of it as weaving, he said. Each stone locks the 2 below it. If you stack seams, you have built a wall that wants to become 2 walls. He made her pull a section and relay it when she stacked 3 seams in a row. She lost an hour. She did not make the mistake again. By the end of the 2nd day with Etienne, the platform stood at 19 inches, 13 days since she had started digging. The river ice had thinned to a gray membrane that buckled and groaned in the afternoon sun. Meltwater ran in braided channels across the flat between the cabin and the bank. The yard was mud, 19 inches. She needed 36. On the 4th day of their work together, Ephraim Cutter came back. He arrived on the mule he used for ferry errands, riding slow along the trace with his hat pulled low. He tied the mule to the cottonwood nearest the cabin, the one with the flood stain he had shown Mara a month ago, and walked inside without knocking. The interior had changed. Half the puncheon floor was gone, replaced by the rising stone mass. The platform now filled its 8x10 footprint completely, a broad rectangle of gray and brown stone mortared in rust-colored clay, standing 22 inches above the packed earth. The stove sat cold against the far wall, waiting to be moved onto the platform once it reached full height. Kindling was stacked in the remaining floor space. The room smelled of wet clay, river stone, and wood smoke from the small outdoor fire where Mara cooked. Etienne was setting a cornerstone. He did not look up. Cutter studied the platform in silence. He walked around it. He pressed the face stones with his thumb. He crouched and looked at the base where it met the earth. He stood and measured the height against his own leg. His knee sat roughly at the top course. "This is better work than I expected," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment. "Who laid the base?" "I did," Mara said. He relayed it. Cutter looked at Etienne. "Larocque, I have seen your chimneys. They stand." He turned back to the platform. 22 inches? 22 today. 36 when it is done. It will not be enough. The room went quiet. Mara set down the stone she was holding. "Cutter, I measured the flood marks myself. 3 trees. The highest debris sits at 37 inches above the grade. 36 gives me, well, you measured the marks from the last 20 years, Cutter said. Old widow Palmer, God rest her, told me the flood of 68 went higher. She said water came through her husband's cabin chest high on a grown man. That is more than 3 feet. That is closer to 4. He paused. Palmer was not a liar. She was old and exact. Mara looked at Etienne. His face showed nothing. If Palmer was right, Cutter continued, your platform needs another 6 inches at least, maybe 8, and you do not have time for 8 more inches of stone. Then I will add 4, Mara said. 36 becomes 40. That is another full course, heavy stone, another day you do not have. I will find the day. Cutter shook his head slowly. He looked at the platform again, then at the stove still sitting on the floor, then at the window where the gray light showed braided meltwater crossing the yard. The stove is not up yet, he said. It goes up last, after the final course. Moving that stove is a 2-person job. 3 if you want to keep the firebox intact. He looked at Etienne. Are you staying for the lift? Etienne nodded once. Cutter pulled his hat down and turned toward the door. You are still in the wrong place, he said over his shoulder, but the stonework is honest. He left. Mara watched him ride up the trace. Anna stood in the corner holding a clay bucket she had been carrying in from the mixing pit. Her arms were shaking from the weight. He said it might not be enough, Anna said. He said Palmer remembered higher water. Palmer was one person's memory. What if she was right? Mara took the bucket from Anna's hands and set it down. Then we build higher, she said. Go eat. You have been carrying since morning. Anna went to the outdoor fire where cold cornbread and a strip of salt pork waited. Mara turned back to the platform and began mixing mortar for the next course. Her hands were raw. Her wrist pulsed with a deep ache that ran to the elbow. She had not eaten since dawn. 36 inches was the plan. 40 was the new plan. 4 more inches of heavy stone. Another full course across an 8x10 footprint, using stone she had not yet hauled from a bluff she could barely walk to. And somewhere in the remaining days, the stove had to go up. The pipe had to be refitted. The draft had to be tested. The bed frame had to be shortened and rebuilt on top. The kindling box and water crocks had to be sealed and placed, and the river was already moving. The next 4 days collapsed into a blur of stone, clay, and pain. Day 1 of the final push. Mara and Etienne hauled the heaviest slabs they had yet moved, face stones for the upper courses that weighed between 60 and 90 pounds each. The mule drag made 3 trips to the bluff. On the second trip, a slab shifted on the drag, and Mara lunged to stop it from sliding off. The edge caught her left shin and opened a gash 4 inches long. She wrapped it with a torn strip of petticoat and did not stop. Day 2. They laid the 5th and 6th courses. Etienne worked with a precision that left no space for error. Every stone was tested, tapped, leveled, and tested again. Mara laid the fill stones between the face courses, smaller pieces packed tight with clay, creating a solid mass rather than a hollow shell. The platform was now a single dense block of stone rising from the earth like a geological feature. Anna carried clay buckets until her shoulders seized, and Mara made her stop. The child sat against the wall and watched them work, her face blank, her hands red and cracked. She did not complain. She had stopped complaining weeks ago, and the silence was worse than any protest. Day 3. The stove had to move. This was the moment that could wreck everything. The Acme No. 7 weighed roughly 220 pounds with the grates and ash pan removed. The warming shelf was already cracked. If the firebox cracked during the lift, they would have no stove and no way to afford another one. Etienne built a ramp from planks and 2 round poles he cut from a cottonwood limb. crude rollers that the stove's flat base could slide across. He greased the poles with tallow. Mara positioned the pry bar under the front edge, while Etienne braced the back. Anna stood at the top of the ramp with a wedge, ready to block the stove if it slipped backward. "On three," Etienne said. "Slow. If it tilts, let it go back and start again. Do not fight it." 1, 2, 3. They lifted. The stove rose off the floor and onto the first roller. Mara's wrist felt like it was tearing inside the wrapping. She shifted her grip to the pry bar, using leverage instead of lift, and walked the front edge forward while Etienne pushed from behind. The stove rolled 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet. It reached the ramp's incline and wanted to slide back. Anna jammed the wedge behind it. Etienne repositioned. They pushed again. The stove reached the top of the platform and settled onto the flat stone surface Etienne had leveled that morning. It rocked once. Mara's heart stopped and then found its seat. The base sat flat. The firebox door faced the room. The pipe collar aligned with the existing flue path almost exactly. Nobody spoke. Mara put her hand on the stove's cold iron side and felt it sitting on stone that sat on stone that sat on earth. It did not rock. It did not tilt. It sat like it had grown there. "Now the pipe," Etienne said. They fitted the pipe in sections, working from the stove collar up through the tin roof penetration. The angle was slightly different at the new height, and the uppermost section needed a shim of hammered tin to seal the gap. Etienne produced the tin from his kit. He had brought it without being asked, which meant he had known the pipe would need adjustment before they started. When the last section was seated, Mara built a small test fire. Kindling, then a split log. The smoke climbed the pipe and found the sky. The draft pulled clean. No backdraft, no smoke leak, no wobble in the connection. Etienne watched the smoke from outside. He came back in and checked the pipe joints with his hand, feeling for escaping heat. Everything was tight. "The draft is good," he said. "Do not let the fire die before you test it for 6 hours. If the pipe is going to fail, it will fail when the metal expands." Mara fed the fire. The stove ticked as the iron heated. The warmth that rose from it was the same warmth it had always given, but now it came from 3 feet in the air. Standing in the room, Mara felt the heat at her chest instead of her shins. The platform had changed the physics of the room. Heat rose from above the floodline and filled the upper space. Below the platform's edge, the air was cool. Day 4, the bed frame. Mara shortened the legs by 8 inches so it would sit level on the platform's surface without being too high to climb onto. Anna's straw tick went on top. The kindling box, rebuilt with a hinged lid, sat beside the stove. 2 sealed water crocks, 5 gallons each, went against the back wall of the platform. A stool, cut down, gave them a place to sit while cooking. The platform was done. 40 inches, 4 inches higher than the original plan. Every surface of it was stone and clay, packed dense, mortared tight, tested by Etienne's hands and Mara's hands and gravity itself. The stove sat on top like a crown on a rough throne. The bed sat beside it. The kindling was dry. The water was sealed. Below the platform, the cabin floor was bare earth and torn puncheons, ugly, incomplete, deliberately sacrificed. It looked like a house that had been vandalized from the inside. The settlement noticed. Lena Burdick came to see it and stood in the doorway for a full minute without entering. "You did it," she said. It was not admiration. It was the tone of a woman acknowledging that another woman has done something she herself would never have attempted. "It looks like a hearth in a church." "It is a hearth in a flood," Mara said. "If the flood comes. The trees say it will." Lena looked at the platform, at the stove glowing on top of it. at the bed where Anna sat reading the one book they owned. She shook her head slowly. If you are right, I hope you can fit more than 2 people up there, because when the water comes for my house, I will be walking to yours. She left without laughing. That was progress. Cutter came by once more and measured the height against the wall marks Mara had charcoaled. 40 inches. He pressed the face stones. He tapped the mortar joints with his knuckle. If Palmer was telling the truth about 68, he said, you are still close, but close is better than underwater. He paused at the door. Keep your axe on the platform. If the water comes higher than this, you may need to chop through the roof. Mara set the axe beside the kindling box that evening. She did not tell Anna what it was for. The days passed. Snow rotted on the shaded banks. The river carried bark, then sticks, then branches thick as a man's arm. The ice turned from white to gray to a dark, slick membrane that split and reformed with each warm afternoon. Nights dropped cold enough to refreeze the crust, but the days were warm, too warm, and on April 19th, a rain came. Not a hard rain, a steady, warm rain that lasted 14 hours and turned every slope in the drainage into a sluice. Mara set charcoal marks on the inside wall at the waterline she could see from her yard stakes. She checked them at dawn and dusk. The river rose an inch on the 19th, 2 inches on the 20th, 3 inches on the 21st when the rain continued lighter but persistent. Rumor came by way of a passing rider that an upstream bend was backing ice. When a river jams, the water behind the jam rises like a bathtub filling with the drain plugged. If the jam holds, the water keeps rising. If the jam breaks, the backed up water releases all at once and the surge moves downstream with a speed that turns shallow crossings into killing currents. Mara did not sleep the night of the 22nd. She lay on the raised bed and listened to the river. Its sound had changed again, not grinding anymore, not the soft chuckle of meltwater in channels. A deeper sound, a murmur with weight behind it, like the hum of a loaded freight wagon rolling downhill, the sound of a volume of water larger than the channel could comfortably hold. At some point in the darkness, Anna's hand found hers. "Is it coming?" Anna asked. "I do not know," Mara said, and for the first time since she had started building, that was the only honest answer. On April 23, 1883, the river came. It did not come gradually. It came the way Cutter had always said it would, fast enough that the people who were not ready had no time to become ready. Mara woke at 4 in the morning to a sound she had never heard before, a deep percussive boom that rolled through the valley like cannon fire, except it did not stop. It repeated, once, twice, 3 times, each report deeper than the last. She was on her feet before the third one faded. She knew what it was before she reached the window. The ice jam upstream had broken. The darkness outside was absolute. No moon, no stars. The cloud cover from the rain still hung low and heavy. But she could hear the water, not the sound from the night before. A new sound, a roar, a sustained, rising roar like wind through timber, except there was no wind. The air was still and wet and warm, and the sound was coming from the river. She lit the lamp. She checked the stove, fire still burning from the banked coals. She added a split log and opened the damper. She woke Anna. "Get on the platform. Stay on the platform. Do not step off the platform for any reason." Anna climbed onto the bed without argument. She pulled the blanket to her chin. Her eyes were wide and dark in the lamplight. Mara pulled on her boots and opened the door. Water. Brown water, moving fast, already covering the yard in a sheet that reflected the lamplight. It was not deep yet, maybe 4 inches where she stood at the threshold, but it was moving. She could see debris in it: sticks, bark, clumps of dead grass, a piece of fence board spinning slowly in the current. The cow was standing in the lean-to, bellowing. The chickens were silent, which meant they were already on their roost and had pulled their feet up. She closed the door. The water came under it immediately. A thin tongue of brown current pushed across the puncheon boards and spread toward the center of the room. It reached the base of the platform and split around it the way a stream splits around a boulder. Within 20 minutes, the water was ankle-deep inside the cabin. The remaining puncheon boards floated free from their joists and bumped gently against the walls. The table legs stood in moving water. A wooden bowl drifted off the table and floated toward the door. Mara climbed onto the platform. She checked the stove, still burning. The firebox door sat 40 inches above the rising water. The warming shelf, cracked but functional, held a pot of last night's beans. The kindling box was dry. The water crocks were sealed. The bed was dry. Anna was dry. Below them, the cabin was becoming a river. By 5 in the morning, the water had risen to 12 inches inside the cabin. Mara could hear it hissing against the log walls, pushing through chinking gaps, carrying silt that would coat everything it touched. Through the window, she saw the settlement in gray pre-dawn light, brown water everywhere, flat and purposeful, moving between buildings as if the valley floor had become the river's new channel. She saw smoke from 2 cabins to the east, then one, then none. The stoves were going out. One by one, across the settlement, the water was reaching fireboxes and drowning them. She could not see it happen, but she could read it in the smoke. A cabin with smoke was a cabin with heat. A cabin without smoke was a cabin where people were standing in cold water with wet wood and no way to make a fire. Her stove burned. At 6, Anna said she needed to bring in the milk pail from the lean-to. The cow had not been milked and was still bellowing. Mara told her no. Anna argued the cow was suffering. The milk would be lost. Mara told her no again. Anna waited until Mara turned to adjust the damper and slipped off the platform. The water was 18 inches deep. Anna gasped when it hit her legs, not from the depth, but from the cold. Snowmelt and rain runoff. The temperature of the water was barely above freezing. She waded to the door, opened it, and pushed through the current to the lean-to. She was gone for 4 minutes. She came back with the milk pail held above her head, water streaming from her clothes, her face white. She was shaking before she reached the platform. Mara pulled her up, stripped her wet dress, wrapped her in the dry blanket from the bed, and sat her beside the stove. Anna's teeth chattered so hard she could not speak. Her lips had gone pale. Her hands were bluish white. Mara boiled water. She filled a tin cup and held it to Anna's mouth. The child drank in small, shaking sips. The shivering did not stop. Mara piled the second blanket on top of the first and pressed her own body against Anna's back, feeding warmth through contact. If the stove had been on the floor, there would be no heat. If the kindling had been on the floor, there would be no fire. If the bed had been on the floor, there would be no dry blanket. Anna would be wrapped in wet wool, standing in cold water, with no way to warm herself. The platform was the only reason the child was not in crisis, but the water was still rising. By 8 in the morning, the water inside the cabin was 26 inches deep. The current had strengthened. A stool that Mara had left on the floor struck the platform's edge and spun away. A storage box broke free from the wall and floated across the room, bumping against the far logs with a hollow knock that repeated every few seconds as the current pushed it back and forth. The sound was maddening. If you are still with this story, if you need to see what happens next, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the water is not done rising, and what Mara does in the next hour changes everything. Through the window, Mara saw movement, a figure in the brown water, wading chest deep, holding something above the current. It was Ephraim Cutter. He was carrying a woman on his back, old Mrs. Hargrove from the cabin nearest the bank, whose stove had gone out before 5 and whose floor sat lower than anyone else's in the settlement. Cutter reached Mara's door and pounded on it. "Open," he called. "She has been in cold water for an hour. Her fire is dead." Mara opened the door. Water surged in with the pressure change. Cutter pushed through the current and brought Mrs. Hargrove to the edge of the platform. The old woman was barely conscious. Her clothes were soaked. Her skin was gray. The platform was 8 feet by 10 feet. On it sat the stove, the kindling box, 2 water crocks, a bed with Anna wrapped in blankets, and 1 stool. There was room for 2 adults to stand, maybe 3 if no one moved. Mara looked at the platform. She looked at Mrs. Hargrove. She looked at the water, now pushing hard enough to rock the floating storage box against the wall with a sound like a fist knocking. She pulled Mrs. Hargrove up onto the stone. The old woman weighed almost nothing. Cutter boosted from below, standing in water to his chest. He did not climb up himself. "There is no room," he said. He looked at the stove. The fire was burning. The pipe was drawing. The warmth hit his face from 3 feet above the waterline, and he closed his eyes for a moment. "Keep her warm. I am going to check the Burdicks." "Cutter, your cabin?" "Gone cold an hour ago. My stove sat on flagstones. The flagstones are under 2 feet of water." He pushed back through the current and out the door. Mara wrapped Mrs. Hargrove in the remaining dry cloth she had, a wool shawl and a cotton sheet. She boiled more water. She held the cup to the old woman's lips. Mrs. Hargrove drank. Her shaking was deep and continuous, but she was alive, and she was dry, and the stove beside her was burning. Anna watched from the bed. Her own shivering had slowed. The color was returning to her face. "How many can the island hold?" Anna asked. She had started calling it the island 3 days ago. The name had stuck. "As many as need it," Mara said. She did not know if that was true. By mid-morning, the water reached its peak. 31 inches inside the cabin, 9 inches below the top of the platform. Mara sat on the stone edge with her feet drawn up and watched the brown current flow through her house like a living thing, carrying boards, straw, a chicken carcass from someone's coop, a child's wooden horse that bumped against the wall and spun in the eddy. The stove burned. The kindling stayed dry. The crocks held clean water. The bed held a child and an old woman, both alive, both warming. Outside, she could count 2 chimneys still producing smoke in the entire settlement. Hers was one of them. She learned later what the rest of the valley endured that morning. Harlan Pike, the quiet bachelor who had stared at his boots in Silas's store, had tried to save flour sacks from his floor-level cabin and had been swept against a fence line by the current. He survived, but the cold exposure was so severe that he could not stop shaking for 2 days afterward and lost feeling in 3 fingers permanently. An older settler named Grote, living alone in a cabin even lower than Mrs. Hargrove's, could not relight his drowned stove and spent the night in wet bedding. He developed pneumonia and did not survive the week. Grote's death was the cost, the price of a stove set on flat stones at floor level in a valley where the river remembered its path every spring. Mara did not know about Grote yet. She did not know about Harlan's fingers. She did not know that Lena Burdick's husband, home by luck from a freight run, had spent the morning standing in 2 feet of water in their cabin trying to restart a stove that would not light because the kindling box had floated away and every piece of wood in the house was soaked. What she knew was this: the water was at 31 inches and the platform stood at 40, and the 9-inch margin between the river and her fire was the entire distance between living and dying. She fed the stove. She boiled water. She kept the child warm, and the old woman breathing and the fire burning above a flood that had drowned every other hearth in the settlement. The river did not recede until early afternoon. It fell slowly, grudgingly, leaving black silt on everything it had touched. The puncheon boards settled back onto the joists at angles, warped and stained. The storage box sat wedged against the far wall. The floor was coated in mud thick enough to hold a boot print. Above it all, the stove ticked softly as the fire burned low, and the platform sat unmoved, 40 inches of stone and clay, solid as the bluff it came from, holding everything that mattered above the line the river had drawn. Mara sat on the edge of the stone island with her feet hanging over the mud-coated floor. Anna was asleep. Mrs. Hargrove was asleep. The cabin was filthy and wrecked below the platform line and dry and warm above it. She looked at the charcoal mark she had drawn on the wall at 37 inches, the old flood height she had measured from the cottonwood bark. The water line from today sat at 31, below her mark, below even her original plan of 36. Cutter had been wrong about Palmer's memory, or Palmer had been right about a different flood, a worse one that had not come this year. Either way, 40 inches had held. But Mara did not feel relief. She felt the specific, physical exhaustion of a person who has built something with her hands and then watched it tested by the one force she built it to withstand. Her wrist throbbed. Her shin wound had reopened during the morning and bled into her boot. Her back ached from crouching on the stone all day. The river made a new sound now, a low, tired gurgle as it drained back toward its channel, pulling debris with it, leaving the valley floor coated in the evidence of where it had been. Outside, a thin line of smoke rose from one other cabin in the settlement. Just one. Mara had kept fire when the valley went cold. She had kept clean water when the wells were fouled. She had kept a dry bed when every mattress in 30 houses was soaked in river mud, and the only person who had believed it would matter was a 10-year-old girl who had called it the island before anyone else understood what it was. The question now was not whether Mara Elling Voss could survive the river. She had survived it. The question was what the valley would do with the fact that one woman, mocked by her neighbors and dismissed by the man who knew the river best, had built the only shelter that held. The flood receded over 2 days. It did not retreat cleanly. It left a black tide line on every wall it had touched, a thick layer of silt on every floor, and the sour smell of river mud in every cabin, every blanket, every piece of clothing that had been below the water line. The settlement looked like it had been dipped in a swamp and pulled back out. Warped boards, stained logs, ash pits full of gray paste where stoves had drowned, fence posts leaning at angles where the current had loosened the packed earth around their bases. Mara spent the first morning after the water dropped shoveling mud from her cabin floor. The puncheon boards were ruined, swollen, split, caked in silt that had worked into every grain. She dragged them out and stacked them by the lean-to for salvage. The bare earth beneath was wet and dark, but it would dry. The walls were stained to a height of 31 inches, a perfect ring of brown that circled the entire room like a bathtub mark. Above that ring, everything was clean: the platform, the stove, the kindling box, the crocks, the bed, Anna's blankets, all of it untouched, sitting on 40 inches of stone and clay, as though the flood had been something that happened to a different house. Mara boiled water on the stove and carried pots of it to the doorway, where she poured it into buckets for anyone who came. 3 families came that first morning. They carried their own containers, pots, jugs, a tin pail with a bent handle. They filled them and carried them home without saying much. One woman, a freighter's wife Mara barely knew, stopped at the door and looked at the platform for a long time. "How did you know?" the woman asked. "The trees," Mara said. The woman shook her head and carried her water away. Ephraim Cutter came in the afternoon. He had been working since dawn, pulling debris from the ferry approach, checking the cable anchor, assessing which cabins had suffered structural damage. His boots were caked in mud to the knee. His face was drawn in a way Mara had not seen before. She learned later that he had been the one to find Grote. The old man had been sitting in his chair, wrapped in a wet blanket, stove cold, eyes open. He had died sometime in the night while the rest of the settlement fought the water in their own houses. Cutter stood in the doorway and looked at the interior, the mud-stained walls, the bare earth floor below the platform, the clean, dry surface above it, the stove still burning, still drawing, still producing the heat and boiled water that half the settlement had come to collect that morning. He walked to the platform and put his hand on the face stones. He pressed them the way he had pressed them a month ago, testing for wobble. Nothing moved. He looked at the water line on the wall, 31 inches. He looked at the platform top, 40 inches, 9 inches of margin. "I told you the river would put your fire out," he said. He did not look at Mara. He looked at the stove. "I was wrong." Mara said nothing. She waited. "Grote is dead," Cutter said. "His stove was set on flat stones, the same as everyone else's. Same as I have done for 11 years on this river." He took his hand off the platform. "I told him the same thing I told you, that the smart play was higher ground. He could not afford it either. But I did not tell him to raise his stove. I did not tell anyone to raise a stove. I told them to leave." "You told me to leave too." "I did." He turned and looked at her. "And you could not leave. So you built this instead. And you were right and I was wrong. And Grote is dead because nobody in this valley, including me, thought to do what you did." The weight of that hung in the room. Cutter was not a man who admitted error easily. He had earned his authority through 12 years of knowing the river better than anyone. To say he was wrong was to say that all his years of knowledge had a gap in them, a gap a 32-year-old widow with a bad wrist had filled with stone and clay. "Palmer's memory was wrong," Mara said. "The water came to 31, not chest high. Palmer's memory may have been right about a different flood, a worse one. You built for a worse one. That is why the margin held." He pulled his hat down. "You should show the others how high to set it. Before next spring." He left. Mara heard his boots on the wet ground, heavy and slow, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with mud. Lena Burdick came the next morning with 2 of her children and a question she had never expected to ask. Her cabin had taken 22 inches of water. Her stove, set on a flat stone hearth at floor level, had gone cold within the first hour. Her husband had spent 6 hours standing in freezing water trying to relight it with soaked wood. He failed. The family had huddled on the bed. The mattress was wet, but it sat 12 inches off the floor on a frame, so they were above the worst of the current. They survived on body heat and the half jar of cold broth Lena had kept on a high shelf. No one was injured, but the children had been cold, frightened, and crying for 8 hours, and Lena had not been able to warm them or give them clean water. She had sat in the dark, listening to her youngest cough and thinking about the stone island she had called foolish. She stood in Mara's cabin and studied the platform with a different kind of attention than before. Not skeptical attention, measuring attention. She looked at the height, the footprint, the stone courses, the mortar joints, the way the stove sat level on the surface. She looked at how the bed fit. She looked at the kindling box with its hinged lid. She looked at the sealed water crocks. "How high?" she asked. 40 inches from the floor. How wide? 8 feet by 10. How long did it take? 14 days with help, longer without. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered. Can you show me how to build one? Mara looked at her. A month ago, Lena had told her she was crippling her own house. Lena had been reasonable. Lena had been practical. Lena had been wrong. Mara did not say any of that. I can show you how to read the trees first, she said. Then we measure. Lena nodded. She sent her children to play with Anna, who was recovering well from her chill, the shaking fully gone, and followed Mara to the cottonwood line. Mara showed her the flood stain. She showed her the reed fibers caught in the fork. She showed her how to cut a measuring stick to the debris height and carry it back to the cabin to mark against the interior wall. She showed her where her own cabin's stain sat compared to Lena's, 6 inches lower because Mara's lot sat in an old side channel. Your floor's higher than mine, Mara said. Your platform does not need to be as tall. 28 inches might be enough for you. Maybe 30 to be safe. That is still 1.5 feet off the floor. Yes. Where do the children sleep? On the platform. Everyone sleeps on the platform. Everything that matters sits on the platform. The rest of the room is for living when the water's not there and for flooding when the water comes. Lena looked at the stain on the cottonwood bark. She pressed her hand against it, the way Mara had pressed hers a month ago, palm flat, feeling the smooth, stripped surface where the river had scoured the outer bark away. My husband will say it is too much work, Lena said. He spent 6 hours standing in cold water trying to light a drowned stove. Ask him which is more work. Lena almost smiled. Almost. She left with the measuring stick and the beginning of something Mara had not expected to give anyone. The method, not just the result. Over the following 2 weeks, 4 more families came. Each one arrived with the same expression, the look of people who had endured something they never wanted to endure again, and who had seen, in Mara's cabin, evidence that it did not have to be endured at all. Mara showed each of them the same things, the tree scars, the measuring technique, the principles, raise what you cannot replace, stove, fuel, bedding, clean water. Everything else can survive wet or be rebuilt. She drew rough sketches on brown paper, platform dimensions scaled to each cabin's floor plan. She explained the stone selection, the mortar mixing, the joint breaking, the base preparation. She was not a natural teacher. She spoke too fast and assumed knowledge that others did not have. But she showed them her own platform, and the platform taught what her words could not. If this story reminds you that preparation is worth more than luck, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because what Mara built next was bigger than one cabin. Silas Pruitt watched the traffic to Mara's door with the specific attention of a man calculating loss. Every family that adopted Mara's method was a family less likely to abandon a claim, less likely to sell cheap, less likely to need credit on terms Silas controlled. He had built his position in the settlement on other people's vulnerability. Mara was teaching them to be less vulnerable, and every lesson cost him leverage. He did not confront her directly. Not yet. He worked sideways, the way he always worked. He mentioned to the freighter at the ferry landing that Mara's platform had been built by a Métis stone man, and that ordinary families could not replicate it. He told Harlan Pike, still recovering, 3 fingers numb, that Mara's method was fine for a widow with no furniture, but a family of 6 could not live on a shelf. He sold poor quality stone at fair stone prices to 2 families who did not know the difference, and when their mortar crumbled in the summer heat, he said it proved the idea was unsound. Mara heard the talk. She heard it the way she heard the river, as a constant presence that shaped the landscape whether you acknowledged it or not. Etienne Larocque returned 10 days after the flood. He had been upriver with his sons when the water rose. Their camp sat on high ground, and they had watched the surge pass below them, carrying uprooted willows and pieces of fence, when word reached them that the settlement had flooded and that one cabin had held fire through the night. Etienne walked down river to see for himself. He arrived at Mara's cabin and stood inside for 5 minutes without speaking. He examined every course of the platform. He checked the mortar joints. He tested the stovepipe connections. He pressed the cornerstones and the face stones and the fill between them. He crouched and looked at the base where it met the earth. Then he said, "The water reached here." He pointed at the stain on the wall. And the platform held. "It held," Mara said. "How many people were on it at the worst?" "4. Me, Anna, Mrs. Hargrove, and Cutter's wife for 2 hours in the afternoon." Etienne nodded slowly. 4 people and a burning stove on a stone platform in a flooded cabin. That is not a homestead improvement. That is a survival station. The word stayed with Mara. Station. Not a shelf or an altar or a monument to fear. A station, a fixed point where the essential functions of life continued while everything around them failed. She and Etienne spent the next 3 weeks doing what the outline of their work had always pointed toward, making the method teachable. They walked the settlement together, inspecting every cabin that had flooded. They measured floor heights, marked tree scars, calculated platform dimensions for each structure. Etienne brought the precision that Mara lacked. He could look at a cabin interior and see the stone layout in his mind before a single rock was moved. They developed 3 versions. For families building new, a full masonry hearth platform like Mara's, 8 by 10 feet or larger, rising to the measured flood height plus a safety margin. For families in existing cabins who could not afford a full rebuild, a simpler approach. Stone piers and a thick hearth shelf that raised the stove and a small dry fuel cache above the danger line with a raised sleeping platform built from heavy timbers bolted to the wall studs. For the ferry shacks and line camps that housed transient workers, a raised boiling station, just stove, fuel, and water crocks on a compact stone pad, enough to keep one fire alive when the rest went cold. Mara learned more from Etienne during those weeks than she had during the frantic construction before the flood. The pressure was different. Before, every lesson had been delivered against a deadline. Now, the teaching could breathe. Etienne showed her chimney physics, how draft depends on the ratio of flue height to firebox volume, how a pipe that climbs too steeply cools the smoke and creates creosote, how a pipe that angles too far loses draw. He showed her how to set a stove so the firebox sat perfectly level, using a cup of water on the top plate as a gauge. He showed her the difference between mortar that was setting properly and mortar that was drying too fast, which meant it would crack and spall in the first hard freeze. But the most important thing he taught her was not technical. It was structural. They were sitting beside the cabin one evening, eating cold venison and watching the river, low now, docile, murmuring in its banks as though it had never tried to kill anyone. Mara asked him how he had learned stone work. "My mother's brother," Etienne said. "He built the hearth in every house our family lived in. He said a hearth was the first thing you build and the last thing you leave behind. Everything else, the walls, the roof, the furniture, is temporary. The hearth is what makes a house a place where people can live." "Is that why you stopped when you saw me sorting stone?" "I stopped because you were sorting by face. Most people sort by size. Size is lazy, face is attention." He set down his food. "But I stayed because of the platform. You did not build a wall or a chimney. You built a hearth that was also a fortress. I've built 200 hearths. I've never seen one built against a river." "My father taught me to read flood marks," Mara said. He said trees remember what people forget. Your father was correct. Etienne was quiet for a moment. The problem with knowledge like that, knowledge that comes from watching, from old people, from the ground, is that it dies when the person dies. Nobody writes it down. Nobody teaches it in a school. One woman learns to read bark stains and builds a platform that saves 4 lives. She dies, the knowledge dies, and the next woman in the same cabin drowns. So teach more people. That is what we are doing. But you must teach without me, eventually. He looked at her. I will not be here next spring. Mara felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise. She had known Etienne's time was seasonal, that his family was upriver, that his health was not what it had been. She had heard the cough that came on him in the evenings when the air cooled. She had seen him pause on the bluff trail, not from laziness, but from something deeper, a heaviness in his breathing that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Your sons need you, she said. My sons are grown men who can build chimneys without me. You are the one who needs to learn to teach without me. He paused. Next time I show a family how to set a base course, you will do the talking. I will stand behind you and say nothing. I do not teach well. You do not teach at all yet. That is why you must start. He was right. The next morning, when a family named Dortmund came to ask about raising their stove, Etienne stood by the door with his arms crossed and his mouth shut. Mara walked them through the measurement process, the tree scar reading, the platform dimensions, the stone selection. She stumbled. She explained the mortar mixing in the wrong order. She forgot to mention breaking joints until Etienne cleared his throat from the doorway. But by the 3rd family, she was better. By the 5th, she could walk a cabin and prescribe a platform height without checking her notes. Etienne nodded when she finished and said nothing, which was the highest compliment he gave. 2 weeks later, Etienne left. He packed his tools in the leather roll, loaded his kit on a borrowed mule, and walked the trace north toward his son's camp. He did not make a speech. He did not promise to return. He shook Mara's hand, the bad left hand, deliberately, gently, and looked at the platform through the open door. Do not lower it, he said, not even when people tell you the flood was a rare event and you are wasting your room. I will not lower it. And do not stop reading the trees. The marks change. New floods write new lines. A platform that was high enough last year may not be high enough next year. I know. He turned and walked up the trace. Mara watched him until the trail bent around the bluff, and he was gone. That evening, she sat alone on the platform with the stove ticking beside her. Anna was asleep. The cabin was quiet. The river murmured. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, the same magpie that had been calling since November gave its sharp 2-note cry. Mara pressed her hand against the face stone nearest the stove, the one Etienne had laid first, the one he had tested by pressing center, corner, and edge until it sat dead. The stone was warm from the fire's heat, stored in the dense grain the way a body stores warmth. She could feel the work in it, not just the weight and the shape, but the intention. Every stone in the platform had been chosen, tested, placed, and tested again by a man who believed that the first thing you build is the last thing you leave behind. He had given her more than skill. He had given her the understanding that knowledge carried in one person's hands is knowledge waiting to die, and that the only way to save it is to put it in other people's hands before yours give out. She did not know yet that Etienne Larocque would die the following winter of the chest sickness that had been building in him for months. She would hear about it from a writer in February, a brief message, almost an afterthought, that the old Métis Mason at the upper camp had passed in his sleep. The news would reach her on a cold morning while she was teaching a woman named Goss how to read floodstain on cottonwood bark and she would finish the lesson before she let herself sit down and press her hands against her face. But that was months away. Tonight, the stone was warm, the stove was burning, and the knowledge was still in her hands. Summer came with a different kind of trouble. The flood had left more than mud and warped boards. It had left contamination. The wells closest to the river, shallow, hand-dug, lined with nothing but stacked field stone, had been overtopped by floodwater. Silt and organic debris had settled into the water table. By late June, 3 families were reporting stomach illness. By early July, it was 7. The symptoms were the same in every household: cramping, fever, weakness that lasted days. Children were hit hardest. Lena Burdick's youngest, a boy of 4, developed a fever that spiked so high Lena sent her eldest running to Mara's cabin at midnight. Mara arrived to find the boy shaking on a bed in a cabin that smelled of sour sweat and river mud that had never been fully cleaned from the floor cracks. Lena's husband was away on another freight run. Lena was holding the boy's head over a basin, her face white. The water, Lena said. "We have been drinking from the well since the flood. I boiled it for the first week. Then the wood ran low, and I stopped." Mara felt the boy's forehead, hot enough to frighten her. She looked at the basin. The water in it was faintly cloudy, not obviously dirty, but not clean. "Bring me your water bucket," Mara said. The bucket held the last of the well water. Mara held it to the lamp. Tiny flecks of sediment drifted in suspension. The water had a faint smell, not rotten, but organic. Mud. Flood residue still leaching from the silted well lining into every bucket drawn. "This well is contaminated," Mara said. "Everyone drawing from it is drinking flood water." "Every well on this side is the same," Lena said. "There is no other source close enough." Mara looked at the stove. Lena's stove, the one that had drowned in the flood, was functioning again, though the firebox had developed a crack from the thermal shock of going from heated iron to cold water. It still burned, but it leaked smoke at the seam. "You need to boil every drop," Mara said. "And you need to boil it on a fire you can maintain without interruption. That means dry fuel stored above contamination reach. That means a dedicated boiling station, stove, fuel, water crocks that never goes cold." She heard herself saying the words and realized she was describing the platform, not as flood protection now, but as sanitation infrastructure. The same design, raise the essentials above the threat, applied to contaminated groundwater as naturally as it applied to rising river water. She stayed with Lena until dawn, boiling water in shifts, cooling it, pouring it into cleaned crocks. She showed Lena how to build a temporary raised fuel shelf from planks and stone blocks, not a full platform, just enough to keep a day's worth of kindling above the damp floor where mold and flood residue still lingered. Over the next 2 weeks, Mara visited every household reporting illness. She inspected wells. She tested water by holding it to lamplight and checking for sediment. She prescribed the same treatment everywhere: boil everything, store clean water in sealed crocks above floor level, keep fuel dry and accessible so the boiling never stops. 6 of the 7 households had one thing in common: they had not yet built any version of the raised platform. Their stoves sat at floor level. Their kindling sat on the floor. When wood got damp from summer humidity and residual flood moisture in the cabin, they burned it anyway and accepted the poor heat. When the boiling seemed like too much trouble, when the cramps had not come back for a few days and the water looked clear enough, they stopped boiling and drank straight from the well. The 7th household, the Dortmunds, who had been among the first to ask Mara for help after the flood, had built a simple raised hearth shelf. Their stove sat 18 inches above the floor. Their kindling stayed dry in a lidded box beside it. They had boiled water continuously since the flood because Mara had told them to, and because the raised fuel supply made continuous boiling practical rather than exhausting. The Dortmunds had no illness. The comparison was stark enough that Mara did not need to make the argument. The families who had raised their fire and their fuel were the families whose water was clean. The families who had not were the families whose children were shaking with fever. Silas Pruitt saw an opportunity in the sickness. He began selling what he called purifying powder, a mixture of ash and ground chalk that he claimed would clean well water without boiling. He sold it at 20 cents a packet, which was more than most families could spare after the flood losses. The powder did nothing. If anything, the chalk made the water cloudier, which disguised the contamination without removing it. When Mara heard about the powder, she went to the store. Silas was behind his counter, sorting packets of the chalk mixture into a wooden display box. He looked up when Mara entered, and his expression did not change. "The powder does not work," Mara said. "Ash and chalk do not kill what is in that water. Heat kills it. Boiling kills it. You are selling people a reason to stop boiling." "I am selling people a product they are asking for," Silas said. "Not everyone has time to boil water all day. Not everyone has a stone altar to keep their fire burning." The Burdick boy nearly died. He would have died if his mother had used your powder instead of boiling. The Burdick boy got sick because his mother's well is dirty. That's a well problem, not a powder problem. It is a heat problem. Clean water comes from heat. Heat comes from a fire that does not go out. A fire that does not go out comes from dry fuel stored above the damp. That is what I'm teaching people. That is what works. Your powder does not work. Silas leaned forward on the counter. "You are teaching people to tear up their own houses and live on stone shelves. Some of them can afford that. Most cannot. What I'm selling is cheaper and easier, and if it makes people feel better about their water, that is their choice. People are not choosing between cheap and expensive. They are choosing between sick children and well children." The room was quiet. Harlan Pike was there again, always there, sitting on a barrel near the door, his damaged hand wrapped in a cloth. He watched the exchange without expression. Mara left without buying anything. She did not slam the door. She did not raise her voice. She walked out into the July sun and stood in the road for a moment, feeling the heat on her face and the anger in her chest. Silas would not stop selling the powder. She could not make him. What she could do was keep teaching, keep showing, keep walking the cabins and inspecting the wells and measuring the tree scars and building the case, not through argument, but through demonstration. Through the Dortmunds, who had no illness. Through Lena, who was now boiling every drop and whose boy was recovering. Through every family that raised their fire and kept their water clean and stayed healthy while their neighbors sickened. The secondary crisis resolved slowly. By August, the worst wells had been dug deeper or abandoned. Families had learned, some through Mara's teaching, some through their own suffering, that flood-contaminated water required sustained boiling, not chalk powder. Silas's packets stopped selling. He did not acknowledge that they had been useless. He simply stopped stocking them and moved on to other inventory. But the episode had hardened something in the valley. The flood had been dramatic, a single terrible night. The contamination was slower, quieter, and in some ways more dangerous because it did not look like a crisis. It looked like normal water in a normal well. And it took a woman who had already built one kind of defense against the river to recognize that the same principle, raise the essentials above the threat, applied to a threat no one could see. Mara did not frame it that way. She was not a philosopher. She was a woman with a bad wrist and a stone platform and a dead mentor's voice in her head telling her that knowledge dies when the person carrying it dies. She taught because Etienne had told her to teach. She taught because Grote was dead, and the Burdick boy had almost followed. She taught because she had looked at a flood stain on a cottonwood trunk and seen what everyone else had dismissed as bark damage, and the distance between seeing and not seeing was the distance between a warm cabin and a cold one. By the end of that summer, the valley had changed. Not completely, not uniformly, but enough that the change was visible if you knew where to look. A raised stone pad in the Dortmund cabin, a heavy timber sleeping shelf in the Burdick house, a compact boiling station in the ferry shack where transient workers slept. 6 houses by the second thaw. The beginning of something that had no name yet but had a shape, the shape of a woman's hand pressing against stone, testing for wobble, finding none. The autumn of 1883 brought frost early, and Mara welcomed it. Cold air meant dry air. Dry air meant dry wood. Dry wood meant fires that burned clean and stoves that drew without complaint. After the summer sickness, after the flood's wreckage, after the endless teaching and inspecting and arguing with Silas Pruitt about chalk powder and cheap stone, the cold felt like a rest. It was not a rest. It was preparation for the next test. Mara had spent the summer learning what Etienne had tried to tell her before he left, that a good idea must become teachable or it dies with one person. She had taught 6 families the full method. She had taught another 4 the simplified version, raised hearth shelves and fuel caches that could be built in a weekend with available stone. She had walked every cabin in the settlement at least twice, measuring floor heights, reading tree scars, calculating the gap between what the river had done and what it could do. But she had also learned something Etienne had not prepared her for: the difference between showing someone a method and convincing them to maintain it. The Goss family had built a fine raised hearth shelf in July, 18 inches, solid stone, proper mortar. By September, the wife had stacked canning jars on it because the shelf was flat and convenient, and the flood seemed like a long time ago. The stove sat on top, crowded between glass jars of preserved beans and tomatoes. The kindling box had been moved to the floor to make room. Mara visited and said nothing about the jars at first. She looked at the arrangement. She looked at the floor, where the kindling box now sat in the exact position that would be underwater in any repetition of the April flood. "If the water comes tomorrow," Mara said, "your kindling is the first thing it touches." Mrs. Goss looked at the floor. She looked at the kindling box. She looked at the jars on the shelf. "The flood was 6 months ago," she said. "It may not come again for years." "The trees do not know that. They still carry the marks." "The trees carry marks from 20 years ago. I cannot live my whole life at flood height." This was the argument Mara would fight for years. Not against people who denied the flood, against people who remembered it but believed it was finished. The river had come once. It would not come again soon. The urgency faded. The platform became a shelf. The shelf became a pantry. The pantry sat at the wrong height for the wrong reason, and the next flood would find kindling on the floor exactly where it had been before. Mara moved the jars herself. She put the kindling box back on the shelf. She did not ask permission. Mrs. Goss watched with the expression of a woman being corrected in her own kitchen, which was exactly what was happening. "You can put the jars on a separate shelf," Mara said. "I will show you where to hang one that does not interfere with the fuel." She built a hanging shelf from 2 boards and rope. It held the jars. The kindling box stayed on the hearth shelf beside the stove. Mrs. Goss said nothing more about it, but Mara could see in her face the calculation every frontier woman made. The cost of being prepared weighed against the cost of living, as though disaster was always imminent. There was no easy answer to that calculation. Mara could not promise the flood would return. She could only point at the bark and say it had returned before. The real test of whether the method would survive came not from a reluctant household, but from the man who had spent the year trying to kill it. The spring of 1884 was wet. Not as violent as '83, no ice jam, no overnight surge, but persistent. Rain fell for 6 days in the second week of April. The river rose steadily, without drama, the way a pot of water rises when you leave the tap running. No booming ice, no rushing current, just a slow, relentless climb that pushed the waterline higher each morning. By the 5th day, the lower cabins had water at the door sill. By the 6th, 3 cabins had water inside. The Dortmunds, whose raised hearth sat at 22 inches, stayed dry and burning. Lena Burdick's husband, who had finally built the timber sleeping platform and raised stove shelf that Lena had demanded after the '83 flood, kept his fire alive through 2 days of ankle-deep water in the main room. The ferry shack's compact boiling station, Mara's simplest design, held above 6 inches of standing water and provided hot water to the workers who slept there. The families who had built stayed warm. The families who had not, or who had let their preparations lapse, like the Goss family before Mara's visit, scrambled. Silas Pruitt's store sat on the same flat as the rest of the settlement, 30 yards from the ferry road. He had built it with a plank floor raised 8 inches on log sills, standard construction, adequate for mud, but not for a real rise. Inside, he kept his ledgers on a desk at floor level. His dry goods sat on shelves, but the lowest shelves were only a foot off the floor. His own stove, a large box stove he used for heat and for warming the store on trade days, sat on a flagstone pad at floor level, identical to every other stove installation in the valley, before Mara had changed the pattern. On the morning of the 6th day, water entered the store. Mara heard about it from Harlan Pike, who had walked past the store and seen Silas standing in 3 inches of brown water, pulling ledger books from the desk and stacking them on the counter. Pike told Mara with the careful neutrality of a man who had watched the same person mock and scheme for a year and was now watching the river deliver its own verdict. Mara did not go immediately. She waited a day. She let the water make its argument. Then she walked to the store. Silas was alone. The water had risen to 5 inches overnight and had ruined the lowest shelf of dry goods, flour sacks, salt bags, a box of candles, and a crate of nails that would rust. The stove was still burning, but barely. The firebox door sat 10 inches above the floor. 5 more inches of water, and the fire would drown exactly the way every other floor-level fire in the valley had drowned the year before. He looked up when Mara entered. His expression was complicated, not hostile, not humbled, but tight. The expression of a man who knows what is about to be said and does not want to hear it. Mara did not say it. She looked at the stove. She looked at the water. She looked at the ledgers stacked on the counter. "Your stove has maybe 4 inches of clearance left," she said. "If the rain continues tonight, you lose fire by morning. I know what I lose. I can show you how to build a temporary raise, stone blocks under the stove legs, braced with mortar. It will not be pretty, but it will buy you 8 inches. Enough to hold through this rise." Silas said nothing for a long moment. The water moved gently around his boots. Outside, the rain had slowed but not stopped. The river was still climbing. "I do not need a platform," he said. "I need 3 days without rain." "You do not control the rain. You control the stove height." Another silence. Mara could see the calculation in his face, the same calculation every person in the valley made, but with an added weight. Silas had spent a year dismissing her method. He had sold bad stone. He had sold useless powder. He had told anyone who would listen that grief had made her unsteady and that stone altars were vanity. To accept her help now was to concede publicly what the river had been demonstrating privately, that she had been right and he had been wrong. "I'm not asking you to build a platform," Mara said. "I'm asking you to save your stove." Silas looked at the water. He looked at the stove. He looked at the ledger books on the counter, the record of every debt and credit in the settlement, the architecture of his power, stacked on a surface that was itself only 30 inches above a rising flood. "Show my boys how high to set it," he said. He did not say please. He did not say thank you. He said it the way a man gives a military order, clipped, flat, stripped of everything except the necessary information. But he said it, and in saying it, he conceded something he would never concede in words, that the woman he had mocked for building a stone island in her cabin had understood the valley better than he had. Mara brought stone from her own surplus pile. She and Silas's 2 sons, boys of 16 and 14, who had their father's sharp features but not his hostility, raised the store stove 8 inches on mortared blocks in 3 hours. It was rough work, nothing like Etienne's precision, but it held. The fire stayed lit. The water peaked that night at 7 inches inside the store and receded by morning. Silas never spoke of it publicly. He did not thank Mara. He did not recommend her method, but he stopped undermining it. The gossip ceased. The bad stone disappeared from his shelves. And when a new family arrived in the settlement the following autumn and asked where to set their cabin, Silas, without looking at Mara, without acknowledging the source of the information, told them to check the trees before they chose a floor height. That was his conversion, not warm, not generous, grudging, quiet, delivered through silence rather than speech, but real. The river had done what argument could not. Thomas Burdick arrived in the settlement in the autumn of 1884, and Mara did not notice him for 3 weeks. He was Lena's brother-in-law, her late husband's brother, which was incorrect. He was Lena's husband's brother, alive and employed, a wagon carpenter by trade who had been working in Bozeman and had come east to help his brother with a freight contract. He was 36, lean, quiet, and precise in the way that woodworkers are precise, measuring twice, cutting once, apologizing never. Mara met him when Lena asked her to inspect the sleeping platform her husband had built. The platform was solid, but the access, a set of rough steps made from split logs, was dangerous. The risers were uneven, the treads were narrow, and Lena's youngest had already fallen off them twice. "My husband built the platform," Lena said. "He did not build the stairs. He says stairs are not his concern." "Stairs are everyone's concern when a 4-year-old uses them in the dark," Mara said. Thomas was in the cabin when she arrived. He was crouching beside the steps, running his hand along the treads the way Etienne had run his hand along stone faces, testing by touch, reading the surface for information. He had already identified the problem. The split log treads were rounded on top, which meant wet feet or stocking feet would slip. The risers varied by 2 inches, which meant a child's body could not learn the rhythm of the climb. "These need flat treads and even risers," he said to Mara without introduction. "And a rail, even a rope rail." "I agree," Mara said. He looked at her. "You built the stone platform they copied this from." "I built the first one. Etienne Larocque taught me the stonework." "Larocque. I have seen his chimney at the freight station in Bozeman. Good mortar." He stood. "I can build proper steps. Flat tread, 6-inch riser, rope rail on the open side. It will take me a day." "What do you need?" "Lumber, 1-inch boards, and someone to tell me the standard platform height so I can build steps that match every version in the settlement, not just this one." Mara looked at him with new attention. He had not asked about the flood. He had not asked why people were building stone shelves in their cabins. He had identified a problem, dangerous access, and proposed a standardized solution. He was thinking about the method as a system, not as Mara's personal invention. The standard heights range from 18 to 40 inches depending on the cabin's position, she said. Most are between 24 and 36. Then I need an adjustable step design, something I can build in 2 configurations that covers that range. He pulled a stub of pencil from his pocket and began sketching on a piece of scrap wood. 3-step for the low platforms, 5-step for the high ones. Same tread width, same riser height, just more or fewer units. He built the first set for Lena's cabin that week. Flat treads, even risers. A rope rail knotted through drilled holes. Lena's youngest climbed them without falling. Then he built a second set for the Dortmunds, then a third for a family on the upper road who had raised their stove to 30 inches. He did not court Mara during this work. He did not compliment her or find excuses to visit. He built steps. He improved access to the things she had built. And in doing so, he made the platform system more complete, not just stone and stove and fuel, but the human infrastructure that let children and old people use it safely. Mara watched him work the way Etienne had watched her sort stone, recognizing not need, but method. Thomas saw the platform not as a curiosity, but as a design problem with solvable flaws. His contribution was not strength or sentiment. It was precision applied to the gap between what Mara had built and what ordinary families could safely use. They began working together in the spring of '85, when the next round of platforms was built. Thomas handled access, steps, rails, bed frame modifications that kept mattresses level on the uneven stone surface. Mara handled the stone and the measurements. They argued about tread width and riser height the way craftspeople argue, with specifics, not emotions, each defending a number with a reason behind it. The courtship, such as it was, happened inside the arguments. Thomas respected her knowledge before he respected anything else about her. Mara respected his precision before she noticed anything else about him. They married in the late autumn of 1886 in a ceremony at the ferry landing that Lena organized and Cutter attended. Anna, now 13, stood beside Mara and held her hand through the vows. Silas Pruitt was not invited. He came anyway. He stood at the back and left before the meal. The years compressed in the way frontier years do, not gradually, but in seasons. Each spring brought the same rhythm. Mara walked the cottonwoods, checked the old marks, measured the new ones if the river had risen high enough to write them. She updated her records, charcoal marks on a board kept in the cabin, each line dated and measured, a running history of what the water had done and what it might do again. Thomas built. Not just steps and rails, full platform systems, standardized so a family could construct one from a measured plan instead of relying on Mara's presence. He drew the plans on flatboards in pencil, showing dimensions, stone courses, mortar joints, and access configurations. Mara checked every plan against the tree scar measurements for the specific cabin's location. No 2 platforms were exactly alike because no 2 lots sat at exactly the same height. Anna grew. She learned the tree reading before she learned to cook well. She could walk a lot and prescribe a platform height by the time she was 15. She taught younger children to check the bark each spring the way other children were taught to check fence lines. A seasonal chore, not an emergency measure. The knowledge passed from Mara's hands to Anna's the way Etienne had said it must, through repetition, through practice, through the slow accumulation of seasons that prove the method worked not once but every year. New families arrived. The settlement grew from 30-odd souls to nearly 60 by 1888. The new arrivals heard about the flood of '83 the way all frontier stories are heard. in pieces, at the store, at the ferry landing, over meals. They heard about the woman who had built a stone island in her cabin and kept fire while the rest of the valley went cold. Some believed it was exaggeration. Those families built at floor level and waited for the river to teach them what it had already taught everyone else. The river obliged, not every year, not always dramatically, but often enough, a significant rise in '86, a brief but sharp surge in '89, that the lesson stayed current. Each time the water came, the families with raised platforms kept fire and clean water. The families without scrambled, soaked, and suffered. 12 houses by the fourth thaw, the ferry shack, 2 line camps on the upper road. A new cabin built from scratch on the Dortmund pattern, platform first, walls second, the hearth rising before the roof was set. The method had become custom, not because Mara had argued for it, but because the river kept demonstrating it. Mara taught younger women and men alike. She taught them what Etienne had taught her: stone selection, mortar mixing, joint breaking, base preparation, and she taught them what her father had taught her: the bark reading, the flood stain interpretation, the understanding that rivers write their intentions on the landscape, and the only question is whether you read the writing or ignore it. Her bad wrist stiffened more each spring. The cold and damp settled into the old injury and turned it from an ache to a limitation. By 1890, she could no longer lift base stones. She stood beside the work and directed, hands in her coat pockets, calling adjustments while Thomas or Anna or one of the settlement's younger builders did the lifting. Her eyes were still sharper than anyone else's. She could spot a rocking stone from across the room. She could feel a bad mortar mix by rubbing it between her fingers. She could read a cottonwood's flood history from 30 feet away. The wrist was the price. Every season she paid it. Every season the river confirmed it was worth paying. She and Thomas had no children of their own. Anna remained, not their daughter legally, but their daughter in every way that the word carried weight. Anna married a surveyor's son in 1891 and built her own cabin on a lot she chose by reading the trees first and filing the claim second. Her platform was 30 inches. Her steps were Thomas's design. Her kindling box was a copy of Mara's, right down to the hinged lid. When the surveyor's son asked Anna why she had chosen that particular lot, she told him what Mara had told her on a cold November night in a half-finished cabin 11 years earlier. The river forgets itself every year, but the trees do not. By the spring of 1893, 10 years after the flood that had killed Grote and drowned every stove in the settlement, except 123 houses in the valley, had some version of Mara's raised survival core. Full masonry platforms in the newer cabins, timber and stone hearth shelves in the older ones, compact boiling stations in the camps and shacks along the road. The detail that marked the change was not dramatic. It was domestic. Families set their first interior measurement by flood height instead of convenience. Stoves sat higher than tables. Kindling boxes wore lids. Water crocks lived on stone, not on wood. The alteration was so embedded in the way people built that newcomers assumed it was how frontier cabins had always been constructed in river valleys. They did not know it had started with one woman, one measuring stick, and one stain on cottonwood bark. Mara Elling Voss lived on the same claim where Jonas had set the first logs in 1882. The cabin had been rebuilt twice, once after a roof collapse in '87, once when Thomas expanded it for the workshop where he drew his platform plans. The original stone island still stood in the main room, unmoved, unaltered, its 40 inches of mortared fieldstone holding the same Acme No. 7 stove that had burned through the night of April 23rd while brown water moved through the house below it. Mara died in the winter of 1904 in the bed that sat on the platform Etienne Larocque had helped her build. Her left hand rested on the face stone nearest the stove, the one he had laid first, the one he had tested by pressing center, corner, and edge. The stone was warm. It was always warm. Ephraim Cutter had stood in that doorway in the spring of 1883 and told her what the river would do. "When that river comes through your floor," he had said, "widow or not, it will put your fire out and drown you where you sleep." On April 23rd of that year, the river came through her floor at 4 in the morning and rose to 31 inches by midday. It drowned every hearth in the settlement. It killed a man named Grote, who had no fire and no dry blanket and no way to warm himself through the night. It put out every stove that sat where stoves had always sat, on flat stones, at floor level, within easy reach of the water that remembered its path every spring. But in one cabin on the lowest lot in the valley, a kettle kept boiling above the flood line while wet families walked through brown current toward the only door with smoke above it. A child slept dry under blankets while chairs floated below the bed. And Mara Elling Voss sat on the edge of a stone island she had built with broken hands and borrowed knowledge, feeding a fire that the river could not reach. She did not defeat the river. She only believed what it had already written